Well, hello and welcome. I am Holly Peipenberg from the Pulitzer Center. Thank you for joining us today. As we wait to get started here, we'd love to know where you're joining us from in the chat. We ourselves are spread out across the globe, so we'd love to know where you're from as well. For those who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization with the mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. We're based in Washington, D.C., but our staff and our work are global. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world, bringing together this work by themes on our website, including racial justice, migration, public health, and more. And we don't stop with the reporting. Our education programming spans from elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public, like our event today. A few logistics before we begin. Our aim is to incorporate audience questions if possible as part of today's conversation. So if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A icon on your screen. There also is that chat icon. After sharing where you're from, we'd appreciate it if you'd use that in the future only for specific technology issues. All attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us, let us know via that chat box. And we want to let you know we are recording this session to post online at a later date. And finally, please remember to stay online once the conversation ends to participate in a brief survey. We'd love to know how we can improve our programming for you. Now, please allow me to introduce today's guests. Sarah Shourd is a trauma-informed investigative journalist, playwright, and 2019 Stanford Knight Fellow, whose most recent project, Dying for Justice in America's Jails, investigates how decarceration and COVID-19 deaths in jails and prisons have exposed that death by suicide, brutality, and medical neglect in our nation's jails is far from new or specific to this pandemic. Sukanya Shantha is Senior Assistant Editor at The Wire. Her series, Barred, a Prisons Project, sheds light on the extreme living conditions, lack of medical care and legal support, and violence within India's prison system. Justine Vanderlin's project, No Choice But to Do It, How Women Are Criminalized for Surviving, interrogates the way in which abuse, misogyny, and structural inequalities result in punishment of the most marginalized. She's an independent journalist and a fellow at Type Media Center. And moderating our discussion today is H.R. Venkatesh, a journalist at Boom Live and an International Center for Journalists Knight Fellow. With that, I'll turn things over to him. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Holly, and everyone else at the Pulitzer Center. Also, thank you to you three, Sarah, Justine, Sukanya. Thank you for everyone else for tuning in. Now, how do we compress such a vast, underreported and misunderstood topic, global mass incarceration, in 1 hour? One way of looking at it is as another conversation in a series of conversations going back decades and probably going forward a few decades, realistically speaking, even though we don't want to have to talk about this, it's probably that we're going to be talking about it for a couple of decades more at least. It kind of takes the pressure off one thing, for example, of talking about it in an hour. But for this session, we thought that rather than me simply ask questions to the three panelists, we'll try and make it more of a conversation. And so here's how it's going to unfold. I'm going to ask Sarah here the first question, and she will answer it, and then take the conversation towards Justine, and they will chat for about 10 minutes. After which Sarah will bring it back to me. We'll chat for a few minutes, and then I will ask Sukanya questions for another 10 minutes. After that, I'll ask for final thoughts. If the panelists want to reflect or want to ask each other questions, that's the time for that. And then we will take questions from the audience, and we'll finish things off with a reflection. So first question to you, Sarah. You've been working in this space, telling urgent stories, underreported stories for at least a decade. And I dare say you've seen all kinds of prison reporting. Tell us about how you developed this framework really for, telling these stories, but including prison ethics or trauma-informed ethics in your reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I developed it because I care about the people that I'm reporting about, and also because I'm invested in doing everything in a trauma-informed way. I mean, I think from architecture to the way that we, teach our children, we should be thinking about all of us as many of us, the majority of us, of having suffered some sort of trauma in our lives. But obviously, with mass incarceration, that every single person you encounter, from the incarcerated people to their families, and arguably the guards and administrators, they're all in an extremely traumatic situation. So in a way, trauma-informed journalism is just good journalism. It's listening to people, following up, being patient, taking the time to sit with very difficult emotions. You know, sometimes the people that I'm interviewing get very triggered, very angry with me. It's about saying, let's take a break and come back to this. And I'm here for you. I'm here to listen, and I'm not going to just disappear and bail or bully you or push you into talking about something that maybe you're not ready to talk about, you haven't processed yet. You know, what I really love to hear from the people that I've worked with, and I've traveled to prisons all across the country and interviewed you know, probably hundreds of people now that have been incarcerated and their families. And what I'd love to hear, what I do love to hear, which I heard recently, is when someone says to me, this is a completely different experience than I've ever had with a journalist. Usually I end this, you know, feeling so terrible about myself and the whole process, and I don't feel that my story represents me. You don't know if you're always going to get there, but I feel that I'm working in line with my values if I do everything I can to get that response.
Yeah. So I got it. But when you say trauma-induced or trauma-informed, rather, reporting, you're talking about everyone else. Do you include the reporter in the trauma as well?
Well, sure. And my sensitivity to people's trauma definitely comes from the fact that I was incarcerated myself, and I was held as a political hostage 12 years ago by the Iranian government for 410 days in solitary confinement. And I've been on the other side of the equation. When I was in the media spotlight, I had horrible treatment from journalists that said inappropriate things to me off the air, you know, judgments that were completely insensitive to my experience. And so obviously my sensitivity and my compassion was generated from my own experience. And it also puts me in a better place to understand people's trauma from incarceration.
Right, and you spoke about Iran, you spoke about your experiences covering incarceration in the United States. We have Justine, I believe you have a question for her, Sarah.
Yes, yeah, let's bring you into the conversation, Justine. I mean, we both have experienced, I'm sure, the obstacles of reporting in prisons. I'm curious, what are the obstacles that you've encountered in telling these stories, and how have you found ways around them?
Good question. So I think that probably the obstacles, you know, and I'm particularly curious about, you know, your specific kind of, I think you've mentioned previously that you're doing a bit of training on how to even be better trauma informed, or maybe you've done that. So I'm really interested in hearing some of the things you've taken from that. I think the main obstacles in the US are, for me, as I've experienced it, time, money, and access. So access means, you know, I've been reporting on mass incarceration maybe for 2 or 3 years pretty exclusively. But prior to that, I would do like immersive reporting with people. I would go spend a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, a year, you know, and as much as I needed with these people. And you cannot do that with people who are incarcerated. So that kind of access that allows you to see someone's life from the inside is not possible. I think the connected to that is the money factor, because in the US, telecommunications are corporate and are privatized largely. And it's a really sort of secretive business. It's worth, we think, well over $1 billion. But you know what that means is when I'm trying to talk to people on the phone, and this is obviously a problem for me as a reporter, but really a problem for the families of incarcerated people and the incarcerated people themselves, who often work for no money or work for starting at 3 cents an hour. A phone call can cost $2. And if you actually are trying, and it's capped at 20 minutes, so that's time and money in there. So if you're actually trying to really do a story on somebody, you're trying to have these recorded, censored conversations where people know that quite often district attorneys, prosecutors are going to comb through these. So they're really not able to even speak or express themselves freely. And the amount of money you spend to really get to know somebody is actually immense, because $2 doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think you have 20 minutes with somebody, you can spend, for my Pulitzer Center project that I did, part of the funding that I asked for was something like, I want to say $500 or $1,000 just to make phone calls with people, just to have enough time to make calls. And they can only call me, right? So it's also, I can't call somebody. You can go through the bureaucracy in a prison to try to get an interview. But that will also be capped. So again, time. I went into a prison recently, I think a couple of days ago, and it was actually facilitated very well by the state that I was in. It worked. They didn't say I couldn't come, but the interview was for a couple hours and it was capped at that. And so what I would love, I've gone and met people in the visiting rooms uncensored. Just talk to them to let them know, like, I'm not here to extract something from you and just leave. I can also come and just talk to you freely. But I definitely left feeling like, and there was somebody there, not recording anything, but just overseeing it as just a policy. So I was asking somebody questions that are pretty traumatic. And I felt very much like kind of out of control of the situation myself. Like I couldn't ensure this person's comfort, but at the same time, I need to get the truth that they want to get out. So it's a very tricky balance where it's not like a normal human interaction, where you can have it and you can ease it and you can feel it out and you can take your time until someone's comfortable. It's this like falsified relationship that happens. So those are kind of, navigating trauma and truth, navigating a bureaucracy, navigating rules, navigating the immense restrictions on people and their very real and legitimate lack of trust, and their lack of the ability to believe that what they're saying is going to be taken as they want and not, taken out of context. Those are all huge obstacles. And as far as finding solutions to those, my solution is to, I've gone into prisons and jails and immigration facilities in a number of ways. I've gone in for on the record interviews, which I find difficult but doable depending on the state. I've gone in, if journalists are of the audience, I've gone in with lawyers as a paralegal, because I guess the definition of paralegal is just someone who's standing with the lawyer. So you might not be able to like record something, but you can write things down in those. And as far as people on the phone, and by the way, you can of course use letters, but just letters which are longer and by mail, it's not it's a pen palship, it's not getting all of your questions answered. I think one of the main things that I try to think about is how to incorporate the inherent restriction of what you're faced with into how you express that in print. So like, it's a challenge, and I would prefer that I weren't so restricted when reporting out of prisons. On the other hand, I'm trying to think about how do I incorporate that, how restrictive it is into the writing, the censorship, because that's also their experience and what they're living. So I do try to think of it as like a parallel in, my experience being so confined with my reporting is only just a little sliver of their experience. So that's been my sort of get funding for the, trying to like ahead of time get funding so that I will not feel pressed with the money when I want to talk to somebody as much as possible. Going in any way I can, sometimes not as like a reporter, just as a person, so that someone trusts me a little more. So when I go in as a reporter on an official basis, I'm not just a random person popping up and being like, can you tell me about the worst things in your life? Now I'm going to head out. and access wise, just doing what I can, immersing myself as much as I can. But the thing that I would kind of, I don't know if our format allows for this, but I'm so curious for you, and if you had 2 hours, or which is good, or maybe 1 hour with someone, and you're trying to get that information, you have these questions you need answered because you don't know if you're going to get to go back again. How do you like make that balance between needing to get what you need to get, not controlling the environment or really the time, and possibly just, or somewhat inevitably, re-traumatizing the person that you're talking to? So that's sort of my question right now.
Are you asking me? Or
yeah. If you have any thoughts on that, because
well, I mean, this is the, sort of impossible situation that journalists that report on prisons are in. On one hand, you need to, and ethically, you need to build trust with the people that you're interviewing and their families. And they have every reason not to trust both journalists and the institutions of this country, because they've been in, they've been subject to a very corrupt institution. Our system of mass incarceration in this country is not in any way transparent. We don't have oversight. And in order to get the burden of proof should be on the institution, but our government has not held these institutions accountable. We do not have anything close to proper oversight. So the journalist is trying to compensate for this huge failure that has allowed mass incarceration to grow into the monstrosity that it is. Millions and millions of people being warehoused in inhumane conditions. And right. For the journalist to have to balance out that equation, the burden of proof falls on us, and yet we can't get that information. So just to really briefly follow up with what Justine was saying, I mean, with trauma-informed journalism, you have to put the person before the story, right? But in order to get the truth out, you have to also put the story before everything else. And so, we do our best, but really the failure here is I really think that you can't emphasize enough that our government has failed to provide oversight to make these institutions accountable.
That was so neatly put, Sarah, about the story before the person, and the person before the story, and the eternal dilemma. It kind of reminded me of The Journalist and the Murderer by Janet Malcolm, where, in the end, you're just wondering, who should we be asking more tough questions of in that particular story? Is it the journalist? And so, before I go to Sukanya, I want to quickly ask you this. You did say, of course, and both of you spoke about how we need to be careful. But what happens when journalists themselves are poorly trained and they don't understand this? This isn't something that's taught in journalism school, I think.
Yeah, well, journalism school needs to catch up to real life. And I mean, I never went to journalism school, but I mean, all three of us, I'm sure we've learned in the field the reality that we're facing. And also, in journalism as an institution needs to catch up, because obviously we need rigorous journalism. But again, if we're relying on corrupt institutions to give us information, right now I'm reporting, I can't say too much about it because the article's not out, but I'm reporting for The Atlantic about Cook County Jail. And Cook County Jail in Chicago is more transparent than most. They've given me a ton of information, but they don't have oversight. I can't verify this data. And the testimonies of incarcerated people are of course a counter narrative and important, but the way that society is structured, inequality is baked into this system where the person that's been abused by the system doesn't have the data to back up their story, and that data doesn't exist. No matter how rigorous I am, I can't find it. So how do we actually remedy the institutionalized inequality that we're dealing with in order to be vigorous? It isn't always possible, but the story still needs to get out. So we need to talk about that.
Indeed, indeed. I'm going to turn the lens over to Sukanya. Sukanya, a lot of the stuff we do in Indian journalism, I know from personal experience as well, and not just restricted to prisons, is taking a cue out of how journalism is practiced in places like America. And when it comes to prison reporting, I do know, of course, there are parallels between how there are criminalized communities in the United States and there are criminalized communities in India. And I do, of course, want to ask you about caste. But first, before we get into that, what is it like to report on prisons and the incarcerated population in India or in any of the states? I would imagine, being a journalist in India myself, that it's just not enough. There's not enough of the reporting going on. It's not even enough to sometimes make that drop in the bucket.
Yeah, so like in India, if you look at like almost all established mainstream legacy newspapers, you realize that we don't have a dedicated human rights beat reporter. So like as in none of these newspapers or also news channels, you do not have like a person who's actually given the job of looking at human rights stories on a day-to-day basis. This is happening in a country which is considered to be the largest democracy and something which is so integral to human existence, like human rights, doesn't actually get covered as a core beat. So when human rights as an issue, it actually finds a space in media only when something really big or something like really phenomenal is actually unfolding somewhere in the country. So if you have say a movement that is actually building up, or maybe like some brutal incident that has happened somewhere, only at that point, someone like would actually from a newsroom would be someone like who's considered to be very sensitive would be sent out
Yes.
to cover the issue. And once the issue actually dies, the reporter is supposed to the reporter is supposed to return to their primary beat. So if human rights as an issue gets like such a limited attention, so one can only imagine what it must be like when it comes to say issue concerning the carceral system. Like prisons actually barely makes a cut. Like we don't really have prison being covered on a day-to-day basis in India. Also, prison as a subject is also looked at as an extension, as a mere extension of say the crime or a police beat. So a reporter who say like assigned to cover like a particular locality, a crime in a particular locality, the same reporter would also end up covering the same issue inside the prison. So a reporter who was closely following up and whose only source for information is say a policeman would actually be relying on say a prison official or a state to get the information out. So when both Sarah and Justin are actually speaking about trauma-informed reporting in India, our reporting is all about prison space as an extension of a space of crime outside in the society. So we don't like we barely have stories of people like of incarcerated persons like actually speaking about their lives inside in the prison. The
Yes.
only stories like you would actually hear in the media is about say prison break or prison riots, or maybe like at best you'll have like stories of some supposed gang lord or maybe like some drug lord who is actually supposedly operating out of the prison space. So yeah, basically like we barely have like stories of what incarceration could do actually to an individual. Actually, all of this could be better explained with like a short example actually. So like 7 years ago, like a decade ago, when I had actually begun as a reporter, that's also the time when Mumbai had actually had like a major terror attack that happened in Mumbai in 2008. Where a bunch of Pakistani men had actually entered the city and had killed like hundreds of Indians and foreign nationals in different locations in the country. Almost all of those gunmen were actually killed, but one, a lone surviving Pakistani gunman called Ajmal Kasab was actually set on trial in one of the special courts that was set inside the prison. So prison is a space where reporters in India don't get an access, absolutely. And that was perhaps the first time we were actually, or maybe second time, like where in the Indian history, like where reporters were allowed to actually enter the prison on a daily basis and actually cover the event. So when Kasab was actually set on trial, his lawyers were actually arguing on some very important issues. One was about solitary confinement, and the second was about there was this whole debate about whether or not he was a minor who was tried in a court meant for trial for adults. So I remember, like, I was still like a cub reporter who had like just barely like a year of experience of actually covering judiciary as a beat, like that was assigned to me. So there was this whole discussion that was actually building up around human rights of a prisoner, and even if he is a terror accused, like still like there was like this some empathy that was actually building up, and some attempt was made to humanize this prisoner. But the moment that actually began, and there was like this whole issue was gaining momentum, the chief public prosecutor, who was actually appearing for the state then, went on a news channel and made this absolutely baseless and irresponsible claim that the terror accused is demanding biryani in the prison. So biryani is basically like one exotic Indian rice and meat dish that's quite popular in the country. So that moment, the entire like overnight, like the whole the premise of our reporting changed. Like suddenly, like from empathizing or maybe like even humanizing this terror accused, like we had now begun asking question like, how dare a prisoner demand good food? So our entire understanding was like a prisoner doesn't deserve like good food or good quality like good treatment in the prison. Eventually, Kasab was convicted and also awarded capital punishment and hanged. Yeah. So basically, like, So that's the thing.
It really is a well-documented case, and yes, that was a good example to just show what reporting is like on this topic. I think we're doing well on time, so I'm going to ask you this other question about, as you said, there isn't enough reporting, and all the reporting is through the lens of a crime reporter. But recently you did do a story where you found out in a state prison in the state of Rajasthan that people who were incarcerated were being given jobs that corresponded to their caste or caste. It was stunning because this is illegal in India, and we had absolutely no idea this is going on. And your reporting shone a light on that. Is it a widespread problem across prisons here in India?
So yeah, like that report actually was about prisons across the country, and Rajasthan was perhaps the first state to have acted upon like our report. Like Rajasthan High Court had suo motu taken up the case, and then it actually decided to do away with a 70-year-old prison law. So caste is basically like it's a reality. It's a social reality that none of us can actually in India like actually say that we are untouched by caste. Like you, me, everyone across the caste religion like actually will have like their lives being influenced by caste in some or other form. But somehow like this is something that actually doesn't find a presence in the prevalent prison discourse that we have. Like actually like what happens is every year around say September to November every year, the government's National Crime Report Report Bureau, NCRB, actually comes out with a data which is primarily speaks about the crime in the country and also the prison statistics. So this gives like a breakdown of number of people who are in prison, their age, gender, the caste, and the religion. Like all of it is actually put down, and also educational qualification. So when this data actually is put out, that's a time when we realize that like around that time, like every newspaper will actually have like 1 or 2 stories like around that whole data. So that's the time when like when say the data of like the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribe, and several other like backward classes which are incarcerated, which basically which like actually the data indicates that over 70% of India's prison population, the population being around 0.5 million, the 70% of that population actually belongs to these caste categories. So this data actually makes it to a story then. But that's about it. We actually speak about caste only when the data is put out. And this data is not even like something that that newspapers, the reporters, or maybe like even organizations which have been working for prison rights have actually come out with. This is the data
Yes.
which government provides us, and we take it on a, like it's provided to us on a platter, and we just like put it out as a news. So we have actually not even made efforts to problematize caste around the carceral system. Like I'm sure, like when it comes to the US, if one were to actually talk about incarceration, you cannot leave out race. But in India, like this is like where 70% of Indian population, which of prison population belongs to the marginalized caste identities across religion. Still, like this has not really become like a point of discussion. And because it has not become, like just one point, because it's actually because of that, like it's very difficult to actually have any discussions around the presence, the existence of caste in prison, and prison structure basically is like a caste structure. The caste structure that we see outside in society is something very similar in the prisons. Yeah, Venkatesh.
Yeah, that was a good way to put it for us all to understand it, Sukanya, because Sarah, Justine, I don't know what your reactions are, but when she said that you can't report about incarceration in the United States without race, but in India, the same is true of caste, but there's not much reporting around caste. And it just occurred to me as well that when we deny this reality, we are not just re-traumatizing individuals, we're re-traumatizing entire communities. So I wonder if this is an opportunity with which we can talk a little bit about bringing in the race lens to this conversation. I don't know if that's a good idea, given that we're just wrapping up everyone's first thoughts. But I leave it to you, Sarah. Do you have any reactions, or Justine?
Well, I can start, Justine, unless you'd like to.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, absolutely. You have to report through an anti-racist lens. And that's, we also live in a caste system, Sukanya. The system of mass incarceration perpetuates racial inequality, and the trajectory goes all the way back to, all the way back to slavery. A lot of times people need a specific example to make this connection, because it's not something that they, live and breathe every day through, like those of us reporting on these topics. So there's a jail in St. Louis, Missouri, called the Workhouse. There's been a campaign to close it for a long time. It's filthy. There was, a huge COVID outbreak there, and people are treated in a horribly inhumane way. The majority of people there are there because they can't afford bail, and they're there for crimes of poverty, and they're Black people. Before it was a jail, the Workhouse was a stone quarry where Black people had to pay off their debt by breaking stones. A lot of them were former slaves or descendants of former slaves. So it's a very clear, example of the trajectory of slavery into our institution of mass incarceration. So you can't report on that without doing everything that you can to undo that inequality in order to find some sort of balance and fairness. There was something Sukanya said that I wanted to respond to. I mean, both of you have said so many things, but do you want to jump in, Justine?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that Sukanya was talking about, this data coming out, and I think one thing that I've seen, and part of my project that for the Pulitzer Center and the Appeal and the New Republic, was trying to find some data of my own, because it's so lacking, particularly when it comes to women. It's particularly lacking, but the state just, there's some places like the Prison Policy Institute, the other main think tank that makes research is slipping my mind, even though I've actually worked with them a great deal. And they're the ones who kind of get like the whole pie stuff, who get the numbers, but it's still really lacking. So we know that, say, Black women are incarcerated. I believe they're disproportionately incarcerated, I think 3 times more likely to be incarcerated. But I speak on correction. I would go to the Prison Policy Full Pie website to look at that statistic exactly. where I try to, because we're so lacking in exactly what's going on there, because we know that prison is very much a place, I think, as it sounds like in India, to disappear marginalized people that we've failed previously with our other systems. Now, in America, we are especially resource rich and capable when it comes to, we're very incapable, and like we have no idea what's going on. It's an individual issue. The whole time someone needs your help early on every level, schooling, family-wise, resources, and therapy for trauma. And as soon as something happens, whether they do it or we just need to say they did it, we're super competent at putting these people away. I tend, because I don't have as much data as I would like, I tend to look at how race is in women's prisons through the stories of women, like and Black women and white women, as I've seen, in addition to the numbers being different, or the disproportionate incarceration. Also, I should say Native American women in particular states, they just like have very different inside the prison experiences, particularly in certain states. And it makes me think of a woman in Texas whose name is Quinetta Harris, who has been in solitary confinement for, I think, 5 years plus now. And her experiences in the system, and in particular, what I've heard from her and other people about Texas uses unpaid labor, and it's mandatory for people. So, and a lot of it is in the fields with a man on horseback. And they actually have like a frequently asked questions part of their website where it's like, does Texas use chain gangs? And then they're like, no, it's just people doing labor for free with a person on a horse watching them, but there's not a chain, really. And so I've sort of seen that Black women are particularly treated differently in that situation, for example, made to work outside more. And so I try to tend to report through stories because I don't have quite the data that I want, but those stories are consistent and happen across the country.
And can I just add briefly, those stories are so crucial for the public to hear, because as Sukanya was saying, already the public is taught to dehumanize people that are imprisoned, right? And we have a story about them that they're all violent, they're all mass murderers. They're already treated or, through the lens of dehumanization, or seen through that lens. So the public has a very inaccurate idea of who we're locking up. They're often, the majority of people in solitary confinement are mentally ill. Our systems have failed them. They're poor. They've faced rampant racism their whole lives and for generations. And so changing the story that the public perceives is an essential thing. I wanted to also bring up, these people are incredibly brave to participate to put themselves on the line. When Justine was talking about the problem of calling people and not knowing if those calls are monitored, or someone's prosecutor could be listening in. I've literally been on a conversation with someone in jail and then had their prosecutor call me on my phone. So it's absolutely real that they have access to the call logs and who these people are talking to. So they're already taking a risk. They could be imprisoned longer for talking to us. The least we can do is to tell their stories accurately and with compassion.
Yeah. For those of you who haven't seen what I've just typed in, we're taking questions. And please type them in, and we'll try and answer as many of them as possible. Sukanya, as people bring in questions, and Sarah and Justine, there's a question by Rukael Johnson. I hope I got your name right. If you want to read it, think about it. Let me get a 30-second reaction or a reflection from Sukanya on what you both have been saying.
You
Sukanya?
want me to react on the question?
Yeah, if you have any thoughts. Otherwise, we'll go straight to the questions.
I was listening to both Sarah and Justin though. So like in India, like we don't have an access to prisons, right? So like the moment they were like actually talking about the ways that the several creative ways that they have actually come up with in accessing prisons, and I I started thinking about like maybe there are like some ways like I could actually enter into prison space, like as in like Justin mentioned about like going in as a paralegal. Like in the past, I've like made efforts, and I've been like thrown out several times. So I think like this is something that I should actually try, because you cannot be reporting about a space that you have so little access to. So one will have to come up with like some creative ways to do that. Yeah.
Yes. And my mistake, there are questions and also in the Q&A tab down below. So maybe we can start with Melissa Pavlik's question. She says, I work with incarcerated men and women in MA in Restorative Justice Ministry program at 2 facilities in Illinois. These students are curious to know more about any relationships you may have established with journalists who are currently incarcerated and the work you may have done with them, or any hopes or ideas you may have for the future in terms of collaborating with reporters housed on the inside. Do you want to take that, either of you, Justine, Sarah?
I can just quickly say that I know a few writers, because I worked with PEN America. And so if anyone's interested in, getting to know writers on the inside, people who are writing from the inside, PEN America is a fantastic organization, a literary organization, but it also runs a lot of programs with writers who are incarcerated. One person I'm quite good friends with is somebody who was in a fellowship cohort with me named Arthur Longworth. He's been in prison in Washington State since he was 19, straight from foster care. And he's done, and speaking of the danger people put themselves in, I mean, he's gone to solitary confinement for what he's written to keep, people I have written directly to me, and they know that there's a chance they'll be punished for writing to me. In terms of collaboration, I try to think of, not as reporters, but with the work that I do with women, I try to think of my work. I mean, I don't want to say it's a collaboration, but I try to insert voices in a kind of a fresh way to put as much of those voices. Like, I don't want to be their voice. I want to be able to help bring their voice out. So not to say that they're necessarily reporters. And I think Sarah might be a little bit more in the know about prison reporters, which might be more established at some men's prisons. But certainly I think as journalists, one way that we can at least better center the voices is just, I'm not sure quite how, I'm trying to figure it out, but giving a lot more space to people's stories and making that kind of the central arc of the narrative. But I think Sarah might have a little bit more insight into the news from prison world.
I wish go ahead.
Before you say anything, Sarah, just wanted to say there are 4 more questions that need answering. So yeah, go ahead, and then I'll toss a question to you.
Well, there are definitely a lot of incarcerated journalists in this country, and I would encourage people to look into San Quentin News and the Appeal and other platforms that have highlighted these voices. And I think Justine is right. Everyone inside that's daring to tell their story through a journalist is participating in the journalist process, because they're putting themselves on the line. They're getting the truth out, often above their own safety.
Okay, Granis Nyangweso asks, as a journalist, how can you ensure your safety while dealing with a story that involves high-powered individuals versus an incarcerated person? Do you want to think about that? Shall I read out another question? So Justine, maybe for you, and then one for you, Sukanya. Justine, I'm giving you Carson Kessler's question. What are some of your tips to finding story ideas about mass incarceration? And then Sarah Combe asks a question for Sukanya. Given the lack of journalists assigned to cover human rights in India, I wonder if you ever collaborate or exchange information with human rights organizations, such as Human Rights Watch. Do you want to take that, Sukanya?
Like we have like a bunch of human rights organizations, like Human Rights Watch is one of them, then Amnesty International, which was forced to shut down like a few months ago from India. Also, like there are like some organizations which are domestic organizations which are working exclusively on the issues of human rights. So we yeah, as in when there are like reports or like there are some issues that requires to be highlighted, we do actually engage with them. Yeah, like as in, like in my conversation when I was saying that like when there is like an issue which is very which is very big and the movement is like really building up, that's when those gets reported. So similarly, when it comes to say Human Rights Watch or any other organization, we actually get in touch with them as and when there is like a serious concern that requires like media's attention. That's the only time when the engagement happens. Yeah, like I wish it was a lot more than that. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Sarah, are you ready?
Well, I mean, in response to that question, it's not my safety that I'm worried about. Really, it's my sanity. It's really about how hard it is to do this kind of reporting, and does the institution of journalism reward it? Do they have our backs? Do they understand what it actually takes in a democratic society, if we want a democratic society, to get the truth out? And when you're dealing with institutions that have long failed the public and have used public money in a way that doesn't benefit us, doesn't make us any safer, doesn't rehabilitate people. And the trauma-informed journalist, to just bring it around to something positive, is we can make a difference if we do journalism differently. My experience has been that it can be a healing experience for people to tell their stories and to be believed for the first time, to show people that the public cares about them, people that have been failed by these institutions. We can be part of the solution of building safer communities through doing accountable, journalism that takes the time to do it right.
Yeah.
And I also, it's such a sort of dark topic. But if you start up relationships with people behind bars, if you're interested in the topics to begin with, and you do it in a trauma-informed way, and as Sarah says, like, it's not about just believing people. As journalists, we're able to back up that starting place of belief with evidence. I mean, that's our job. So I think people, oh, you're like a bleeding heart. It's like, no, it really, the documentation can back up these stories, and you can kind of piece that apart. But I would say, additionally, I actually love this reporting. Like, the people I work with, I really love them. I have developed friendships with people. They give me so much insight. And the fact that people who are disappeared, put away, silenced, marginalized, failed, are still writing out to me and trying to tell a story that's been taken from them from the time they were children, before they were incarcerated. I mean, that's resilience of the human spirit. And I actually think that this particular beat, if done right and if done rigorously, is actually very, nobody ever wants to use the word fun, but it's really rewarding and it's so interesting, and I highly recommend it. And then somebody had asked where to find like stories. I just wanted to circle back and say that, I find that the organizations that work within prisons often know what's going on, and will often be able to connect you to somebody who's in a prison who wants to speak out, because there are a lot of people in prisons who would like to have relationships with reporters, would like to be speaking out, have stories to tell. And I think once you find those issues and start constant communication, you will fall into many stories that need telling. There's really no shortage of them.
Great. We have one question, but it's not in the Q&A. I'll leave that for you, Sarah, or Justine, or Sukanya, if you want to answer it. But it's to do with prisons in America, Sarah. There's a question there about slave prisons in Texas. The asker, Rukael Johnson, wants to know if anyone has reported on this phenomenon. And the word slave is in quotes.
Well, Justine brought up the use of of chain gangs that's not called chain. Nothing in prison is ever called what it is, right? Solitary confinement is, there's 80,000 people in any given day held in conditions that the UN says is torture. No one calls it solitary confinement, right? They call it administrative segregation. They call it protective housing. But there's a great book called Texas Tough. Have you read that one, Justine, about the history of mass incarceration in Texas and the connection to slavery that I recommend? I'll look up the name of the author.
But also Texas, so all of the prisons in Texas, as far as I can tell, all of Texas state prisons have mandatory unpaid labor, which would be slave labor, which is legal in America. And not just Texas, I believe there's 4 or 5 other states, and then the others, almost all other states, the wages are, you might be really have the big bucks if you are hitting after many years $1 an hour. There are really a lot of places where it starts at 3 cents. And yet people still have to buy all their stuff. Like they still need, it's actually not free to be in prison. It's actually quite expensive for you and your family. So that's not a Texas specific, though Texas is remarkable in its own way. It's actually a pretty, it's a common approach to labor of incarcerated people.
Yeah, Texas Tough is by Robert Perkinson.
Okay.
Highly recommend it. And I'll also say, what Justine said is absolutely true, that as journalists, we have to do both. We have to rigorously fact check the personal testimonies that we find. And you can do that, it just takes time. I recently am reporting on a young man who was put in solitary confinement in a jail that I won't name now because the story's not out, that said they had eliminated it. And he said he'd been put in dozens of times. I FOIA'd his disciplinary record. It turned out he'd been put in 54 times, which is a total violation of the jail's policy. So I can back up what he said with their own disciplinary record. But that takes a tremendous amount of time and diligence to go through these reports, and journalism has to reward the institution has to reward the people doing this work. And Venkatesh, you're silenced.
Yes, I was. Yes, I hope I didn't interrupt you. I did think that was a natural end, but also look at the clock, tells me we have about 10 minutes to go, which means I think it's a good time for reflections. So I'll start with you, Sukanya, and then come to Justine, and then we'll end with Sarah on, if you have something you wanted to say but couldn't say, now's the opportunity. Or if you want to reflect on what we've sort of achieved as a collective in this past hour or so, we can use that as well, the time for that. For one, I've learned a lot. So I'll start with you, Sukanya, and then we'll go to Justine.
Yeah, like you, it was like a great learning session for me to actually understand how exactly prisons are covered in the US, and to think about ways that we could actually engage in with the carceral system in India. Just one thing I just felt like I should actually add is my in the entire discussion, it might have actually sounded like I was just complaining about lack of prison reporting or human rights reporting in India. So I thought it's essential to actually make this one note that since the COVID-19 pandemic actually broke out in India in last year, there has been a substantial improvement in the type of reporting that has happened around the prison system. This could also be because the Supreme Court of India has actually taken note of the prison condition and has spoken about decongestion as the need of an hour. And because of that, several states and several actually the high courts of different states have actually deliberated over it and have come up with different rules. So because of that, reporters have slowly begun reporting a lot more around prisons, although it is in a very limited capacity, or maybe it still requires a lot more deliberation and understanding of the discourse, but that has begun. And I think such discussions actually help us to build up an understanding and also do a lot better. So yeah, thank you.
Justine?
No, I mean, it's really nice to, I loved learning about Indian prisons, which sound not great. But I think what your beat is fascinating, and starting to look at and untangle sort of the idea of caste and how that just, goes straight into the prison system. I loved hearing about trauma reporting. Venkatesh, you're a great moderator. And yeah, no, I mean, I just really enjoyed the conversation. And one thing that kind of sticks out to me that I think I have learned through the process, which I think Sarah's kind of reinforcing, is this idea of when reporting on prisons, in addition to the importance of putting the people reporting on first. I think mainly probably the failing of journalism on prisons in the US is the idea that the state is the truth, that what the state says is the truth that happens, and that's the record. And I think, never taking that as the given, never taking that as your one source for what happens in our prisons in America is the best starting point for sort of at least shifting. I know not everybody has the capacity to be immersive in stories and spend their money or the resources, but just not to take the police and the prison rep and like that stuff as the, oh, done, like that's the truth.
Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not some sort of conspiracy, minded way of being. It's not a lot of our system of mass incarceration is so overblown. It can't be done. There are millions of people being locked up. We don't have the infrastructure to do it in a humane way, even in cases where there are prison wardens that are really trying. And I've definitely interviewed people that want to do it right. It's not possible, right? We don't have the resources. We would be completely bankrupt. We'd have to put all of our tax dollars, and even then, prisons are designed to punish. They're not designed to rehabilitate people. So there's a mass reckoning happening around this in our country about where are we putting our resources? Are we putting them in institutions that have failed us and have failed to make us any safer? And so this isn't like this is a lot of times the data we're getting from these institutions is wrong just because of neglect and inefficiency and just people not doing their jobs well. And journalists have to be very, very have to scrutinize these institutions for that reason.
Yeah, what a note to leave this conversation at. I mean, we started with trauma-informed reporting. We've now reached where we're talking about structures and systems and how we need to dismantle the prison industrial complex. And I'm also aware, of course, that we are a pretty global panel, given the fact that, Sarah, you've had experiences in Iran, and Justine, you've written about, even if it's tangentially, about what happened in South Africa. But there are so many places we've not really had a chance to look at. China, what's going on there? Other places in Asia, in Africa, Europe, in the Americas, Latin America, the other countries, the Caribbean countries, and all the other countries in between. So just thinking about prisons and prisoners, really, or incarcerated people, really, all around the world as we close. And for those of you who want to find out more, please follow the Twitter handles of all three panelists. I pasted it there in the box. Grab it before we end this chat. And thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Venkatesh.
Wanted to echo those thanks. We're so grateful for this conversation today, and also grateful to our audience for joining us. And I also wanted to thank my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Kayla Edwards, who was the producer for this session. We appreciate you all for joining us today again. And for those of you who are able, please support our mission with any level of contribution. We're a nonprofit journalism organization, so we do depend on donors to carry on our work. And we'd also like to share, before we go, information about an upcoming event, One River, Two Countries, Solving the Tijuana River Pollution Problem. This conversation is next week on July 6th, and you can register for it and other upcoming events at pulitzercenter.org. Finally, just stay with us a few minutes longer to take a brief survey after we officially close this session. Thank you again for being with us today, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Justine and
Bye-bye.
Sukanya, stay in touch.
Sure.